The crew hammered wooden posts into the stream bed with a handheld hydraulic pounder, driving them deep into the gravel until they stood in a line across the width of the channel. Then they wove freshly cut willow branches between the posts, horizontally, like a wicker fence, and packed mud against the upstream face until water began to pool behind it. 76 of these structures spread across 3.5 kilometers of a dying river in the high desert of eastern Oregon, built entirely from wooden fence posts and sticks. The river was Bridge Creek, a tributary of the John Day, and by 2009 it was barely functioning. The stream had carved itself into a deep, narrow trench, a vertical, walled ditch cut meters below the surrounding land. The water table had dropped so far beneath the surface that the willows and cottonwoods along the banks were dying of thirst on dry terraces above a river they could no longer reach. Summer water temperatures routinely hit 25 degrees Celsius, close to the lethal limit for the threatened steelhead that were supposed to be spawning there. But what made Bridge Creek different from most restoration stories is that the animal capable of fixing this river, the North American beaver, was already there. A handful of colonies had been clinging on for decades, building dams every year, trying to slow the water and raise the level, and every spring, the floods destroyed everything they built. The question wasn't how to bring beavers back. It was how to help the ones already trapped inside a system that was physically beating them. 76 structures made of sticks. 0 beavers introduced. A total project cost of $374,000. This is not a conservation story. It's a physics problem, and the fix was handing it to an animal that weighs less than a Labrador. The Beavers had been trying to repair Bridge Creek for years, and Bridge Creek had been destroying their work for years. The reason comes down to physics. Bridge Creek drains 710 square kilometers of high desert. Historically, it was a braided multi-channel wetland, shallow water spreading across a wide valley floor, held in place by generations of beaver dams that trapped sediment, stored groundwater, and released it slowly through the dry months. That system collapsed over the course of a century. Fur trappers stripped out the beaver population in the 1800s. Cattle grazing destroyed the woody vegetation along the banks. Without dams to slow the current, and without roots to hold the soil, the river started cutting downward. And once it started, the loop locked in. Water trapped in a narrow, steep-walled trench moves faster. Faster water hits the bed harder. The harder it hits, the deeper it cuts. The deeper it cuts, the narrower the trench gets. And the faster the next flood moves through it. By 2005, when baseline monitoring began, the trench was so deep that spring snowmelt was funneled through a corridor barely wide enough to contain it. All of the river's destructive power was concentrated directly on the bed. Nothing could accumulate. No sediment, no gravel, no structure. And the beavers were caught inside that trap. 1 to 4 colonies, small, stressed, barely hanging on, had persisted in the watershed since the 1990s. They built an average of 40 dams a year. But because the surrounding land had been stripped of mature trees, they were building with thin willow shoots, the only material left. Rodents weighing up to 30 kilograms with iron-reinforced incisors that can drop a 10-centimeter tree in under half an hour, evolved to fell timber and reshape entire valleys, now reduced to weaving thin scraps across the mouth of a canyon. 89% of those dams failed within 5 years. Most didn't last a single spring. The beavers were doing exactly what beavers do. The problem was that the river's physics had been altered so completely that the engineering output of a 30-kilogram animal was no longer structurally sufficient. The concentrated force of the spring floods tore their dams apart before any sediment could build up behind them. The insight that drove the intervention was mechanical, not biological. The team behind it, Nick Bouwes and Nick Weber, alongside Michael Pollock of NOAA and Joseph Wheaton of Utah State, didn't need to introduce an animal. They needed to change the physics just enough to let the animal already there do what it was already trying to do. 76 structures installed in September 2009 across 4 treatment reaches. They weren't rigid dams, they were starter skeletons, semi-porous frames designed to let water leak through at low flows and survive one spring flood, giving the beavers a foundation strong enough to build on. What had started as a steelhead recovery experiment was, at its root, a test of whether you could restart an entire river system by giving a handful of trapped animals a foundation that lasted one season longer than anything they could build themselves. The design of the structures was the key to the whole experiment. Traditional stream restoration uses rigid barriers, concrete weirs, anchored log jams, imported boulders that try to stop the water entirely. When a flood hits a rigid wall, the energy doesn't disappear. It concentrates at the base, at the edges, and eventually the structure fails. The fake dams did something different. The woven willow lattice was semi-porous, water leaked slowly through it at low flows and safely overtopped it during floods. The deeply driven posts, about 8 centimeters thick, spaced a third of a meter apart, provided enough grip to hold the weave in place through the exact seasonal window when natural beaver dams were being obliterated. The structure didn't fight the river. It absorbed the blow and let the current pass. Within months of the installation, the creek's behavior started to shift. The starter dam slowed the water, forced it to pool, and the suspended sediment that had been racing through the trench began dropping out. Roughly a quarter of the structures were occupied by beavers within that first season. The animals found the pooling water, recognized the signal, and began weaving their own material into the human-built frames. The real test came with the first spring flood in 2010, the exact event that had been destroying natural beaver dams every year for decades. The starter dams held. Water passed through the lattice and over the crest instead of slamming into a rigid wall. Most structures came through intact. The ones that breached did so at the edges, and the beavers patched them within days. Because the structures survived, the floodwaters dropped their sediment load behind them. The stream bed rose. Groundwater monitoring wells recorded the water table climbing 1 to 3 feet vertically across the treatment reaches. Think about what that means. For the first time in decades, water was reaching the root zones of the plants dying on the terraces above. The willows drank, they sprouted new shoots, and those shoots became the first decent building material available to the beavers in a generation. By the end of 2010, 30-kilogram animals that had spent years building disposable dams now had foundations that lasted through the worst the river could deliver. The question was no longer whether sticks and fence posts could survive a spring flood. It was whether an animal that weighs less than a Labrador could reverse a century of erosion that no amount of concrete had ever managed to touch. The research team kept installing structures between 2010 and 2012, stacking new ones on top of those that had been buried by accumulated sediment, pushing the water level higher. By 2012, 121 fake dams were functioning across the watershed. Then came 2013. Survey crews walked the entire length of Bridge Creek and counted every dam, human-built and natural. The total was 236. 121 of those were the human-built structures. The remaining 115 were completely independent beaver dams, built by the expanding population without any human help, in locations the research team had never touched. The beavers had moved beyond the treatment reaches, building in upstream tributaries, in side channels, in stretches of creek where no posts had ever been driven. And those dams were surviving because the upstream complexes had already dissipated enough flood energy to protect everything downstream. 236 dams, up from an average of 40 that rarely lasted a year. The engine was autonomous. The total wetted surface area of the stream increased by up to 203% as water finally spilled out of the trench and spread across the historic floodplain. Satellite analysis of vegetation density showed a 20% increase in greenery and growth along the banks of treated reaches, willows, sedges, and rushes, colonizing ground that had been bare dirt for decades. But there was a problem nobody had anticipated, or rather, a problem everyone had anticipated that turned out not to exist, and the reason it didn't exist changed what the entire project was about. Every standard model predicted it. The monitoring data, published in 2017, showed the opposite. Daily maximum summer temperatures in the beaver dammed reaches dropped by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius. And within the dam complexes themselves, temperature sensors recorded variation of more than 8 degrees across short distances, pockets of cold water sitting meters from warmer pools, creating a patchwork of temperature zones the fish could move between at will. Here's the thing. The weight of the pooled water behind hundreds of dams was forcing warm surface water downward through the porous gravel of the stream bed into the shallow underground layer beneath. Down there, insulated from the sun, the water exchanged heat with the earth and cooled. Then it seeped back up hundreds of meters downstream as cold springs. The beavers had built, without any awareness of what they were doing, an underground cooling system, pressurizing warm water into the ground and getting cold water back. It's a beautiful system. But the beauty is in the mechanics. What started as a habitat restoration project, drive some posts, help the beavers, see if steelhead respond, was now functioning as climate adaptation infrastructure. The dams weren't just creating living space, they were regulating the temperature of the river itself, buffering it against exactly the kind of warming that climate projections say will intensify across the interior West for decades to come. Before the fake dams went in, 92% of tagged spawners successfully navigated the stream. After the proliferation of over 200 dams, that number was just over 93%. The dams didn't block them. The structures had created side channels, spillways, and deep plunge pools below each crest that the adult fish used as resting stations before pushing over or through. The passage rate actually improved marginally, but it improved because the beavers had given the fish more routes, not fewer. And once those fish reached the spawning grounds, they found a river that bore no resemblance to the sterile trench of a decade earlier. The population data, published in 2016 after 8 years of continuous monitoring, tells the rest of the story. Compared to untreated control reaches, the beaver-engineered sections showed a 52% increase in juvenile survival rate, a 168% increase in fish density and abundance, and a 175% increase in total biomass, meaning the juveniles weren't just more numerous, they were growing bigger and faster in the complex, food-rich habitat the beavers had built around them. The single largest documented improvement in threatened steelhead productivity from any habitat restoration project in the Columbia River Basin. Those original 76 starter dams are rotting now. That was always the plan. The beavers replaced them years ago and keep building new dams, new canals, new ground flooded every year without a single dollar of ongoing construction cost. The total price of the human intervention was $374,000. Traditional restoration of the same stretch would have run between $3.4 million and $34 million, and unlike the beaver system, it would have started degrading the moment the last machine drove away. The methodology has since been adopted across the American West, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Nevada, California. Federal agencies have fast-tracked permitting specifically to scale it. The principle it proved isn't complicated, but it took a decade of hard data to make it undeniable. Sometimes the most effective engineering isn't what you build, it's giving the right builder a foothold that lasts one extra season. The Bridge Creek experiment didn't prove that beavers are useful. That's been understood for centuries. What it proved is that a system locked in a destructive loop can be broken out of that loop with an intervention so cheap and so simple it barely qualifies as construction, provided the engine on the other side of the lock is ready to take over. 76 structures, 0 beavers introduced, $374,000, and a river that now runs itself. If this is the kind of engineering that interests you, landscapes that break, and the mechanisms that fix them, subscribe. There is more of this coming.